General Hospital spoilers teaser after the truth was finally laid bare and the child Sasha had just given birth to was publicly revealed to be the result of her relationship with Michael. The fragile peace they had barely managed to hold on to was instantly shattered. What had been a tenuous calm gave way to a storm of suspicion, judgment, and the looming specter of a custody war. Sasha, still weak and trembling from a traumatic labor, held onto the baby as though her arms were the last bastion of stability left in a crumbling world. She cradled her child with a fierce desperation, as if the infant's heartbeat was the only sound anchoring her to reality amid the din of whispered accusations and dissecting stares. Her hospital bed was no longer a sanctuary, it had become the eye of a hurricane, silent, but on the brink of collapse. Michael, standing only a few feet away, was paralyzed by emotion. As he gazed upon the tiny life now breathing in the aftermath of such chaos, something ancient and unshakable stirred within him. It was more than just fatherhood. It was a visceral awakening, a primal realization that no legal proceeding, no family name, no amount of power or privilege could ever compare to the fragile weight of that baby's presence. In that moment, he didn't just feel like a father. He became one in the deepest, most spiritual sense. The child before him was not an accessory in a courtroom narrative, not a weapon in a war between broken lovers. It was life itself, untainted and demanding nothing but love and truth. The sterile hospital hallway, flooded with pale white light and muffled sounds, felt colder than ever. Every nurse, every onlooker seemed to be silently passing judgment, their eyes carrying the weight of gossip, of speculation, of pity. But Michael no longer cared. He had spent so much of his life trying to be the model son, the perfect heir, the respectable co-parent. Now, all that mattered was the safety of Sasha and the child. Every breath he took from that moment forward, he knew, would have to be in service of protecting them, physically, emotionally, spiritually. And not just protecting them from external harm, but from the very machinery of legal warfare and emotional sabotage that he himself had once helped to perpetuate. When he finally stood before Willow, his former wife, his former ally, and the mother of the boy they had once raised together, it was not fury that filled his eyes. There was no vengeance in his tone. There was only exhaustion, the deep kind that seeps into your bones after years of endless conflict. He looked at her not with bitterness, but with a kind of quiet resignation. He saw in her eyes the same fear that had once haunted him, fear of losing control, of being deemed unfit, of being replaced. She had loved Wiley fiercely, as had he. But somewhere along the line, their shared love for their son had become weaponized, distorted into a struggle for validation. Michael saw it now with clarity. The legal tug-of-war wasn't about the children anymore, it was about pride. It was about winning. And he no longer wanted to win. He wanted peace. In Willow's desperate attempts to preserve the life she believed was slipping from her grasp, Michael recognized a younger version of himself. The version that had once believed that proving he was the better parent would bring him happiness, that possession equated to love. But now, standing on the other side of all the chaos, with Sasha resting in that hospital bed and their child breathing softly in her arms, he saw the truth. True love. Real, honest, vulnerable love, wasn't about holding on. It was about knowing when to let go. So he did. He made the decision not as a surrender, but as a conscious act of healing. Michael informed Willow that she would have full custody of Wiley and Amelia. No joint agreements. No alternating weeks or drawn-out mediations. Just her, as the primary parent. He would always be there for his children, yes. He would never disappear from their lives. But he would no longer allow his need for control to dictate their emotional future. He wanted them to grow up in peace, not under the shadow of constant tension between two people who had long stopped seeing eye to eye. Willow was stunned. She had expected defiance, anticipated another battle. But the man who stood before her now wasn't the same Michael who had once stared down judges and cross-examined lawyers with steely determination. This man was still, composed, grounded in a truth she couldn't deny. And while she felt a surge of triumph, it was quickly overshadowed by something deeper, respect, and perhaps even sadness. Because in that moment, she realized that Michael was no longer fighting her because he had found something worth fighting for. Michael left the hospital that evening not as a defeated man, but as a man finally free from the chains of expectation. He returned to Sasha's room, where she had just fallen asleep with their newborn on her chest. The lighting was soft, and the air smelled faintly of disinfectant and baby powder. He sat down in the chair beside her and simply watched. Not the kind of watching that waits for disaster or measures worth, but the kind that soaks in presence. For the first time in a long time, he wasn't preparing for the next step in a strategy. He wasn't scanning legal documents or drafting rebuttals. He was just there. And it was enough. In the days that followed, Michael withdrew from public life. He bought a modest home on the outskirts of Port Charles, a place with more trees than traffic, more silence than expectation. Sasha moved in with him once she had recovered enough, and together they began the slow, painstaking work of rebuilding not just a life, but an identity. Not as people chained to legacy, but as individuals freed by truth. They laughed over simple things. Spilled formula, late-night diaper changes, the peculiar faces their baby made in sleep. Every shared glance between them carried a kind of quiet reverence, a mutual understanding that this soft, unassuming life, was a second chance neither of them had expected to be granted. The world around them continued spinning. Port Charles remained a whirlwind of betrayal, secrets, and corporate warfare. But in their small corner of it, tucked away from cameras and boardrooms, Michael and Sasha found something infinitely more valuable, peace. And in that peace, they grew stronger, not just as parents, but as partners. They didn't need vows or labels. They didn't need the world's permission to be a family. They had chosen each other in the aftermath of chaos, and that choice, made quietly, without fanfare, was more powerful than any contract ever could be. Because in the end, after all the trials and betrayals and courtroom drama, Michael had learned the greatest lesson of all, that real love is not about holding on. It's about knowing what truly matters, and letting everything else go. And so, Michael did the unthinkable, something that sent shockwaves through every expectation, every prediction, every belief anyone ever held about him. Without fanfare, without negotiation, and without the usual parade of legal advisors, he relinquished full custody of both Wiley and Amelia to Willow. It was not an act of surrender, nor a concession to defeat, and certainly not a renouncement of his role as their father. It was, instead, an act of clarity, an awakening that allowed him to see that the version of family he had been desperately trying to uphold was no longer the one he needed. Michael, for the first time, was not acting to preserve an image or fulfill someone else's narrative. He was listening, truly listening, to his heart, and it no longer spoke in the language of legacy, ambition, or courtroom victories. What it whispered now was something much quieter, yet infinitely more powerful. Protect the ones who are with you now, those who look to you not with judgment, but with trust. His real family was not a polished portrait meant for display, but a fragile, intimate haven formed in the shadows, where Sasha, still bearing the weight of 1,000 losses, had silently brought their child into the world without expectation or demand. Where a baby, unnamed and unaware, had already begun life in uncertainty, craving only warmth and stability. Michael didn't sign the custody transfer with trembling hands or emotional outbursts. There were no tears, no shouts, no last-minute pleas for compromise. He signed it with an eerie calm, the kind of serenity that only arrives when one lays down a heavy burden that had long ceased to serve a purpose. The pen moved across the paper like a release, each stroke shedding years of silent battles, of internal wars fought between duty and desire, pride and peace. It was the shedding of armor worn so long that he had forgotten what it felt like to be bare. Willow was stunned. Not angry, not triumphant, just genuinely stunned. In some quiet corner of her psyche, she had always assumed that Michael would fight to the bitter end, that he would raise armies of lawyers if he had to, that he would never simply let go. She had braced herself for another exhausting series of mediation sessions, prepared for every counter-argument. What she hadn't prepared for was silence. The silence that fell between them after Michael handed her the signed document, with eyes that no longer burned with challenge, but glowed with an unfamiliar softness. That look unraveled something in her. Because in that moment, Willow realized that Michael hadn't given up, he had risen above. For the first time, he had chosen what was right without needing anyone's approval. He wasn't seeking a judge's validation, or the cheers of family members, or the redemption of public opinion. He was simply choosing to do the thing that brought the most peace to the most people, and for that, she could not resent him. She agreed to the arrangement not out of a need to claim victory, but because she saw what he saw, two paths that had once intertwined but now diverged completely. From that day forward, Michael quietly exited the war zone that had once defined his life and retreated into something that looked far more like healing than exile. He moved in with Sasha to a small home nestled along the quiet bend of a river on the outskirts of Port Charles. There were no court summons taped to the front door. No urgent calls from legal teams or panicked emails from family strategists. Just the lull of water brushing against the banks and the occasional chirping of early morning birds. A place where the future didn't have to be dictated by old traumas or family expectations. Within those walls, the soundtrack of their lives changed. It wasn't the clashing of gavel strikes or the sterile silence of negotiation rooms. It was the soft cries of a newborn echoing through the house, mingling with Sasha's laughter, the kind that was hesitant at first, as though she wasn't sure she still had permission to be happy. Michael, once an architect of high-stakes decisions and corporate chess games, now found joy in learning how to swaddle, how to warm a bottle to the perfect temperature, and how to read his daughter's needs in the rise and fall of her tiny chest. And Sasha, slowly but surely, began to believe that maybe she wasn't cursed to lose everything she touched. That maybe love could grow in the aftermath of devastation. That this man beside her, who had once walked through fire with a clenched jaw and armor of expectation, was now the most vulnerable and yet most real version of himself. She didn't ask for forever. She didn't need vows or rings. She just needed what he had already given her, sanctuary. Together, they created a rhythm. A family not built on perfection, but on choice. Every bottle washed, every lullaby hummed, every hand held in the quiet dark was a thread in the tapestry they wove, one stitch at a time. And for Michael, it was enough. More than enough. Because in stepping away from the life that had once consumed him, he had stepped into something greater, not just fatherhood, not just love, but a truth deeper than any courtroom could ever contain. He had become the man who didn't need to be seen as strong to actually be strong. The man who didn't need to win to finally feel whole. The memories of Willow, of Jason, and of the hollow war they had once waged in the name of justice gradually began to fade from Michael's mind, dissolving like fog under the morning sun. The bitterness that had once lived beneath his skin, the legal briefs, the sleepless nights filled with strategy and resentment, the obsessive need to be vindicated, no longer held power over him. Those recollections, once so vivid and defining, were now no more than faint outlines in the background of a present that was simpler, quieter, but infinitely more grounded. The chaos that had once dictated every choice in his life had been replaced by a steady rhythm, unremarkable to outsiders, perhaps, but to Michael, it was everything. In this new chapter, the relationship between Michael and Sasha didn't need a label. It did not require vows or paperwork or declarations shouted across courtrooms or published in society pages. What they shared was something that existed in the quiet glances exchanged over a sleeping child, in the soft brushing of hands while passing each other in the kitchen, in the calm that filled their home despite the turbulence that had once defined their lives. Every morning, as they woke to the coos and cries of their daughter, Michael would look into Sasha's eyes, and she would look into his, and there, in the reflection of each other's gaze, they would see everything they had built, unconventional, perhaps, but real. As long as they had that moment, as long as they could still see themselves and their child in one another, there was no need for anything else. That was enough to keep going. In a world like Port Charles, where deception was currency and truth could be twisted into weapons, Michael had made a radical decision. He chose honesty. Not the kind of honesty written in affidavits or argued before judges, but the kind that resided in the quiet integrity of daily life. The honesty that lay in showing up, not to win, but to nurture. In listening, in letting go, in holding space for others to heal even when it meant stepping away from the center of the story. It was an honesty born of instinct, of heart, of an unshakable devotion to what truly mattered. And Sasha who had lost so much, whose heart had been shattered more times than most could survive, began to believe in home again. Her path to this moment had been anything but gentle. She had buried a child, mourned a future that had been ripped from her hands, and clawed her way through addiction and grief to find solid ground. For so long, she had lived with the fear that everything she touched would eventually crumble. But now, watching Michael cradle their daughter against his chest, his eyes closed as he swayed gently back and forth, she felt something she had not dared to name in years: safety. There were no guarantees in the life they were building. Their house was small, their pasts complicated, their futures uncertain. But what they had was real. Tangible. Not built on expectation or tradition, but on a series of hard-won choices made with trembling hands and open hearts. They were not perfect. Their home was not pristine. But it was theirs. And within its walls, the wounds of the past were slowly knitting into scars, visible, but no longer bleeding. Every smile their child gave them, every sleepy sigh in the middle of the night, every shared glance across a dinner table scattered with bottles and baby toys, was a reminder that they had survived. That they had, against all odds, come through the storm with something worth keeping. Michael no longer needed applause or titles. He no longer needed to prove he was the better man, the better father, the better anything. He had chosen something harder and infinitely more meaningful: to be there. To show up, every day, for the people who needed him, not as a savior or a symbol, but as a man who had made peace with his past and planted himself firmly in the soil of the present. And in doing so, he had given Sasha and their child something more precious than any court could ever grant: a home, not flawless, not grand, but true. A place where love was not demanded, but offered freely. Where truth was not feared, but welcomed. Where healing didn't happen in sweeping gestures, but in the quiet miracle of another day lived together. In the end, what survived was not a name or a legacy, but a heartbeat shared by three people who had nothing left to lose. And everything left to gain.